We're talking to Daniel Estulin. He's a former intelligence officer, former TV host, best-selling author. We're talking 7 million copies plus. He's also a filmmaker. He recently came out with a hard-hitting documentary on the Bilderberg Group, and he's an award-winning journalist, speaker, and consultant. His latest book is In the Shadows of a Presidency, which covers Project Trump, as he calls it. And we'll be talking about U.S. regime change operations currently underway in Venezuela. We'll be talking about President Trump, what the empire and global elites are thinking. It's great to talk to you again, Daniel.
It's wonderful to be on your podcast. We've done this before in Mexico a few years back. It was hugely successful, and I'm very much looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, we first met in 2016. You had, right before that, been in Venezuela visiting, and you were en route to Mexico City to pick up the Best International Journalist Award from the Press Club of Mexico. I was teaching at the MIT of Mexico, the Monterrey Institute of Technology, and my students and I ended up organizing the conference for you there. And so let's start with your trip to Venezuela back then in 2015, 2016. So you went there to consult, to speak, and to work with the universities there. And can you tell us, how you saw Venezuela back then? And you kind of, I guess, foreshadowed what's happening now. I'm sure that's what you were talking about 3 years ago. So can you tell us about that trip back then, how you saw Venezuela, and what's happening now in Venezuela?
Well, for those who don't know me, I've spent 24 years in military counterintelligence of the Russian Federation. I'm a doctor of conceptual intelligence. What we do is we create models that define and explain the future of humanity, at least a generation ahead. I work as a consultant for foreign governments, presidents of different countries, and I also create programs for Joint Chiefs of Staff of three nations. It doesn't matter who they are, but Venezuela, I've worked with them quite a bit since 2010 when. After my visit to Cuba with Fidel Castro, who had read my book on the Bilderberg Group, my first book, The True Story of the Bilderberg Group, and he fell in love with that book, and he was fascinated by this, topic of secret societies and private organizations and supernatural think tanks and all the stuff, they call conspiracy theories, which really are not conspiracy theories because, again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a colonel of Russian military counterintelligence, 24 years of service, and a doctor of conceptual intelligence. But again, it's a kind of stuff that the mainstream media and the government, by giving the label of conspiracy theories, it's keep away from that, don't talk about that, what our goals there. It basically that's where real stuff actually happens. So Castro had read my book, and he invited me to Havana in Cuba. My Spanish is fluent because I was stationed in Spain for many, many years. And we had a wonderful time together. That was in August, last week of August 2010. And he was impressed enough to call Hugo Chavez and said, Hugo actually said, Chavez, you have to meet this guy. And so we had arranged a meeting. That was in October 2010, 2 months later. Unfortunately, we never met because the day before a meeting, Chavez had to go because of Nestor Kirchner's, he died in Argentina, and so we never met. But I've been working on and off with Venezuela for the past 8 years, and for the past, I'd say 4.5 years, I've worked quite a bit with them. Prepared a lot of the programs for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, training programs, that is, not military programs, especially working on the technological aspects of media propaganda, of how it works, the color revolutions. We explain to them different technological advancements, how that apply to today's geopolitical strategic thinking. And so I know them inside out. I know the country well. I speak the language fluently. And what's happening right now in Venezuela, it was easily foreseeable because, again, this is a country that has enormous natural resources, riches beyond, your wildest imaginations. Out of the 17, top minerals, they have 15. They have world's largest untapped oil resources, gold, silver, diamonds, coltan. If you look at Mendeleev's table, anything that's out there, they have it. It's heaven on earth, really. Unfortunately, it's in the hands of people who don't really know how to run the government. And it's not a criticism of left-wing politics, because again, I'm from the Soviet Union, and I'm obviously a socialist. But again, what we're seeing right now are the consequences of not only them not knowing what to do, but this global meltdown we're seeing right now, which basically is a meltdown of economic realities, and the fact that Venezuela is such a key element of world geopolitics from the point of view of natural resources makes them very, very attractive, needless to say, to the interests of the global elite. In that sense, I don't necessarily mean the United States, because it's important uh, to separate fact from fiction. I mean, people are talking about American, imperialist ambitions, American empire, but the United States today, and I'm sure you'll agree, is not a homogenous country. It's a country at war with itself. It's a country divided between those who are for Trump and those who are against Trump. Those who absolutely despise anything that reeks of Trump, whether it's a MAGA hat, or Trump supporters eating in restaurants, or it's the insanity we're seeing today could easily be compared to the last stages of the Roman Empire before it collapsed, and unfortunately, it's just a matter of short time before the entire world economic system comes crashing down, and that obviously applies also to the United States. And again, Venezuela just happened to be in that element in today's geopolitics, where one, natural resources, two, very important geographically, because again, it's in the basin of the Caribbean. It's has the shortest drug route to the United States. But that, I'm not saying that Venezuela sells drugs, as the Americans are saying, but rather because drugs is a lubricant of the world economy, which moves annually $950 billion in cash, almost $1 trillion in cash. The shorter the route, the more money you make. And the tried and true route of Colombia, Central America, Mexico, United States, it's too long. You have to pay a lot of people on the way. Logistically speaking, it's very difficult. And today, more so than ever, especially with Trump wanting to put the wall there, which is one of the reasons he's doing that. And a much shorter and safer route for the global elite is Venezuela to island of Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic, and from there to east coast of the United States, especially New York, where the Dominican gangs basically rule the city, and which again makes it much easier to distribute drugs nationally. But again, what we see, the noise we see in the mainstream press and the geopolitical realities have very little in common, as I'm sure you know.
And you mentioned Colombia. About 2 weeks ago, I was interviewed on Sputnik Radio, the first night of the Venezuela coup, to talk about Colombia, and I was explaining how they had these ELN attacks, this ELN attack in January. And from my research, I saw that there was a reported assassination attempt on the Colombian president Duque, and they were saying it was coming out of Venezuela. They were saying the ELN attack was coming out of Venezuela. So, I was basically saying that there's this new Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, and that Brazil and Colombia are both, U.S. in the U.S. NATO pockets, I guess. And something you've talked about previously is that this global economic system model is collapsing. It's spent, the Bretton Woods U.S. dollar-backed system, and that one of the next logical steps are the creation of these regional unions. And I found it also interesting that I think at the same time all of this is happening, the Colombian president announced a new model for South American regional integration to replace UNASUR, and he calls it PROSUR. So is this is this all kind of linked together?
Well, there are several questions there in one. Well, first of all, the global economy. Again, the backdrop to what we're seeing globally, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, in Europe, in Latin America, in South America, in Middle East, and Africa, in Southeast Asia, Russia, China. It doesn't matter where, any part of the planet, anywhere you touch, any neurological point, you're seeing the same thing globally. It's the collapse of the world economy. It's on the brink of collapse. The size of economic problem is of such magnitude that it simply can't be resolved through government intervention. It doesn't matter what you do. The entire Western financial system is facing this catastrophic collapse of about $4 quadrillion, which is 4 and 15 zeros in case people are wondering what that number is. Derivative bubbles along with credit default swaps and all kinds of other crazy exotic instruments. The global total debt is, when I was writing the book about a year and a half ago, it was like 217 trillion. Today, I think it's like 235 or 240 trillion. The global debt levels are about 325% of the world's gross domestic product. You have $10 trillion of global debt, meaning bonds, securities, derivatives, which are negotiating and traded at negative interest rates. The U.S. debt is 21 trillion, approaching 22. European banks are leveraged at about 30 to 1. So, in other words, even the slightest change in interest rates would lead to global economic collapse. I'm not going to even go into what's happening in Europe, which is, Italy is a basket case. France, you're seeing all the stuff happening with the yellow jackets. England with Brexit, Germany in recession. The Middle East about to go to global thermonuclear war, and so what's coming out of Colombia, with Duque coming up with some kind of a new union. It's silly because again, the problem we have today is that the Bretton Woods economic model based on infinite growth on a finite planet is dead. You can't expand infinitely. It's simply not feasible. So the model that has worked on printing a lot of money to support the to stimulate the economy is now dead. Okay, you have three important dates in the 20th century from economic point of view. At 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve. You had 1944, the Bretton Woods, which made the American dollar the world's reserve currency and expanded America's influence globally. And then all these institutions, World Trade Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, people saying that Bretton Woods is dead. It died in 1971. It hasn't died because these institutions, which are the institutions of the Bretton Woods system, they're alive and well, which means the system is alive and well. Although it's not well, it's alive, but it's not well. And then 1981, which was Reaganomics, again, this whole thing about the vast, massive expansion of the middle class based on debt. Of course, people's salaries didn't go up, but the level of comfort went up. So how much money you actually made went down, but suddenly had everybody had a television set. Now everybody has a smartphone. Everybody has an iPad. There's 2-3 cars in the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that comes at a price of having to pay that debt off. And because today there's no more expansion, because no matter how much money you print, it simply has zero effect on the economy because there's just so much money out there. I don't know if you realize, but for example, one very interesting number, between 1981 and today, if you take out of the equation all the money that the United States government printed, the actual growth in the last almost 40 years has been 0%. And that's the problem globally, and the problem for people like Duque or for anyone out there. Because again, when we're talking about global system, in the United States, people are talking about the Republicans against the Democrats, Trump against Clinton. It's not Republicans against the Democrats because every party out there globally, mainstream parties, they're all form part of the liberal banking financier order. What does that mean? If democracy is the rule by the Democrats, liberalism is the rule by the bankers. So what you're seeing globally, and that's why the Bushes, for example, voted for Clinton in the last elections. And so what you see globally in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, every country in Europe, et cetera, in Latin America, they're all of the parties, the entire global Western system is part of the liberal banking financier order, which is based on the concept of infinite growth, which doesn't exist. And so Trump, who is not the United States, it's very important to understand that people saying Trump, American imperialism, the United States, there are three completely different things. Donald Trump became possible as a result of the collapse of the global system. Okay, and that's why Trump fights against Prime Minister of Canada Trudeau. That's why he was fighting against Peña Nieto, the last president of Mexico. That's why he's up in arms against Theresa May in London and what's her name and Merkel in Germany and Macron in France. That's why he, goes into a meeting with the Secretary General of NATO and gives him a dressing down, before he had his first coffee and a cookie. And that's why he goes into the infamous or the famous legendary G7 meeting, and does what he did to all of the G7 members, because all of the entire structure, be it the World Bank, be it the International Monetary Fund, be it the World Trade Organization, they're NATO alliance, G7, they're all Trump's enemies. Because those who say Trump equals the United States equals global imperialism are totally wrong. They don't understand that Donald Trump is not the United States. Trump is the alternative project of an alternative part of global elite. Because the United States today is still run by the liberal banking financiers. The people behind Hillary Clinton and the Bushes are the same. They are Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the intelligence agencies, Rockefeller, George Soros, Wall Street itself, the bureaucracy of Washington, the financial elites, the World Trade Organization, etc. These are the people behind Clinton and the Bushes and Trudeau and Merkel and May and Macron. They're the same people. And behind Donald Trump, you have the Vatican, you have the European oligarchy, meaning European aristocracy, in other words. You have the European royal families. That project has a different name. It's called Black International. And Black International is land, blood, and soil. Okay? Blood is red, soil is black. And if you look globally at organizations that have these colors, National Socialism is red and black. That's what Black International is. The Jesuits are red and black. Okay, so these are the powers behind the presidency of Donald Trump, and they're the same people behind, the attempted coup d'état in Venezuela, behind Juan Guaido, because he came out of the Jesuit schools. So the Jesuits were, also behind Cuba project and Fidel Castro. They're now doing the same thing in Venezuela. So if you look at it globally, it's not the fight between countries on a national level, because, if countries, let's call it global 1.0, that's a period between 1648 Westphalia until the end of the 1960s and 20th century, so you had countries, constitutions, borders, currencies, etc., etc. Then you had global 2.0, which is end of 1960s, when the Bilderbergers at their meeting in Mont-Tremblant on the outskirts of Montreal in Canada, they decided to create this new concept, one world company limited. In other words, corporations that have a lot more power than any government on the planet. And that's when this whole thing was, global corporations was created. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan's, et cetera, that in a lot of instances are more powerful than most governments. And now we're in global 3.0, post-industrial world of networking, where what's now is being sold and bartered is not energy, but energy of knowledge, which is a different kind of energy. And so what you're seeing globally is the realignment of interests, also realignment of ideas, and the creation of a completely different world, a world not based on the idea of nation states, but rather regionalization of global economies. Because again, Duque, the problem with Duque in Colombia is he and Trump are on two different teams. And that's what people don't understand, because they still think, as a geopolitical initiative. Geo is geography, okay? So when you're talking about duality, okay, so it's with us or with the enemy, with the capitalists or with the communists. But it's not like that, because Duque is a product of International Monetary Fund. And Donald Trump is the enemy of the International Monetary Fund. So for Duque, there's a big problem right now. He has to coexist with the guy who hates him. And the guy who hates him, his name is Donald Trump. But Trump needs him right now, because they want to replace, the Maduro presidency or government in Venezuela and replace it with their stooges. So Duque has a problem, because if he, continues, it's like, sitting on two different stools. So if he sits, with the International Monetary Fund, he goes directly against the wishes of Donald Trump. If he goes with Donald Trump, or he sides with Donald Trump against International Monetary Fund, against World Bank, against World Trade Organization, then World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, they simply destroy Colombia, because Colombia is up to her eyeballs in debt with these organizations. And this is globally. This isn't just in Colombia. So these differences go far beyond what we're used to, traditionally speaking. Okay. And so again, when you start looking, just to summarize everything I said, because it's very different what you hear about in the media. The war today is not between countries, but between global projects. That means that countries no longer play a role. Global projects means that you have different groups of people, conceptually speaking, who are vying for control of yet to be defined global economic model. Because the model we've had up to date doesn't work anymore. It's based on continuous growth on a planet that simply is running out of space. And what you're seeing with Apple, for example, their profit warning and another profit warning, and 2 weeks later another. I mean, Mr. Cook has to understand that the problem that they have is that everybody has an Apple smartphone and an Apple and a computer. You can only have so many computers and Apple smartphones per person. And because we've reached a limit to that, the only thing we have is going down. And there are ways out of the crisis. And one way is global thermonuclear war, which is why the Middle East, for the global elites, is a wonderful place. You got the Jews on the one hand and oil and Arabs on the other. Okay, because what wars do is they write out debts and responsibilities. And yes, we're probably gonna, they're probably gonna kill 4 billion people. But as Mao Zedong said back in 1950 or 1951, if they do that, we still have 1 billion people left. Now it's 1.5 billion, and they will survive. And the Russians will survive, not because we're a big country, population-wise, but we're a big country landmass-wise. Okay, and that's why what you're seeing right now is the energy moving from the Western Hemisphere, from the Atlanticism, to the Pacific region, and all the stuff happening right now globally is the realignment from the West to the East. And Venezuela, again, as a context itself, I'm hearing a lot of stuff that the Chinese are going to come in and help, and the Russians are not going to come in and help. I can tell you that because I've been, again, for 24 years working in the intelligence with Russia. We are not the Soviet Union. We can't do what the Soviet Union did. Our territorial expansion maximum is about 500 kilometers beyond our borders. The Chinese are not interested in helping Venezuela. What you're seeing right now, all this stuff about trade war, it's all utter nonsense. Okay, it's a typical, a cover story of the intelligence level. What they're doing is they're exchanging areas of influence. The Chinese are giving them, as you said, the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, the Chinese are handing the United States Venezuela, and the Americans are giving the Chinese access to the 2 Koreas. Okay, the 2 Koreas are going to merge, and they're going to come under the influence of China. And in fact, we're seeing that right now because there's a new union being created. It's called Northeastern Economic Alliance. That's Russia, China, Japan, Mongolia, and the 2 Koreas. Okay, and so again, that makes sense. And again, North Korea has the military might, South Korea has the technological advantage, and they're going to merge together. And if there is a conflict, needless to say, the North Koreans will destroy the South, because South Korea is liberalism at its finest, meaning lots of food, lots of bodily comfort, but very little fight. And North Koreans, they have a common goal of their nation, and they're willing to die for it. So again, this is what you're seeing globally, and what's happening in Venezuela, what we're seeing in Colombia, what we're seeing in the Middle East. All of these realignments are playing a part in this new, let's say, realignment of global economies, working towards the creation of a new economic model, which again is yet to be born, because to come up with a new Yalta Agreement, a new Bretton Woods, it takes a long time to iron it out, and we don't have that time. And so you're seeing, this whole thing working in spurts, trying to define itself somehow, and basically we're seeing just how hard of a time everybody's having globally to come to some kind of an understanding.
One question I had. So you're saying that these this one faction of the liberal financier elite, the Clintons, the Bushes, the Soroses, the Rockefellers, they're the war hawks, right? If Clinton would have come in, they would have accelerated aggression towards Russia and perhaps gone to war, as you say. And so Trump is this other faction, which backed by industrialists, as you said. Including like Black International and these guys. And so you're saying logically it would make sense for people to get behind Trump, but we're talking about another group of global elites. So it's become like the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. So
it has always been like that. The thing is, with Clinton, it would have been much easier because we would have gone to global nuclear war immediately. Clinton has some serious psychological problems, unresolved childhood issues, her perpetual need to show off her masculinity, and that would have meant going to nuclear war to show that she's macho. Which would have probably meant what I said before. The whole thing with Trump now, if you have to choose between one and the other, you choose Trump, not because Trump is good and she's bad. I mean, good, bad are the things, I would use to talk to my 10-year-old son, but, not to an adult or to an adult audience. What we're seeing with Trump trying to destroy the old liberal order, may give us a chance to actually create a new economic model. Because, again, we haven't had an alternative for the past 3 generations since 1944. The entire edifice of global economy, I'm not only talking about the United States, not Canada or Europe. It's the ratings agencies, it's the banking institutions, it's the think tanks, it's the foundations, it's the secret private organizations such as the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, American Enterprise Institute, the RAND and Hudson and Houston, and Hoover Institutes, and all these RAND and all the think tanks, etc. Globally, they're all part of the liberal financial order, which is why until Trump's presidency, it was very difficult globally to move any of these. Like, for example, I'll give you an example in Russia. Russia's economic policy is actually run out of International Monetary Fund in Washington. I don't know if you know that. Most people don't. They think Russia is an independent country. We're not. Again, we're not the Soviet Union. And so, an example, the person who is Russia's director of Russia's central bank would be an equivalent position to the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Nabiullina. She works directly for International Monetary Fund. Everything she does is destroying Russia's economy, which is in a downward spiral at a rate of about 2.5% per year since the last quarter of 2012. So you're looking about 15% in the last 5 years or so, or 6 years. Not to mention, there's another 15-20% inflation. So that you have 30% of Russian children who are not getting enough, daily vitamins and food, starving to death, basically. That's the situation in Russia. And up until Trump's election, Putin was powerless to move any of the people in the economic ministry who've been there since the time of Bill Clinton. Had he moved the president of Russia's central bank, international, and put somebody like Glaziev in her place, who is a patriot, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, ratings agencies immediately would have, filed a report saying the new, chairman of Russia's central bank is an incompetent boob, which immediately would have meant the Russia's, credit rating would have been downgraded to junk. And because private corporations cannot have a higher credit rating than in the sovereign nation, every Russian company, from Rosneft to Roscosmos to anything out there, immediately would have been downgraded to junk, which means that Russia would have been wiped out in a matter of hours. And so only with Trump becoming president, since 2016, we're seeing a chance to actually dislodge the liberal banking order and from its position of power. Is it working? Well, you're seeing it globally. The fight is to the death. Whereas before you had enough for all these supranational groups to sit down at this proverbial table and to iron out their differences and divvy up the world between them, there's not enough today. Only, like in the film The Highlander, only one can survive. And that's why we're seeing the fight to the death. And Venezuela is an example of it. The United States is another example. I mean, there's no better example than the United States. And people saying the United States is an empire, it's a homogenous country. If it is, explain to me Clinton against Trump. Explain to me Republicans against the Democrats. Explain to me, Antifa against the police. Explain to me, the millennials and all that other stuff you're seeing daily where hordes of these crazy zombies are chasing, people in MAGA hats all over the country. You know what I mean? You can't, because there's a civil war in the United States because the system is broken. Okay, now we're going to see who actually, gets the upper hand. The liberals are going to lose because their main power instrument was, the printing press. Okay, but because that no longer works, because it doesn't matter how much money you print, it has zero effect on the economy, because you can't make the economy work by printing money. That money has to be invented in the real sector, but the real sector is not giving anything because we're in a crisis, and the collapse is coming, which means it's probably going to be a lot worse than what we saw in 2008 and similar to what we actually saw in the Great Depression. Because in 2008, it might have been fixed globally if everyone worked together. But instead of fixing it, you made it worse. And today's the entire model is now 70% more in debt than it was in 2008, and we no longer have any of the economic and financial instruments that were available back in 2008 to try to fix this. So it doesn't matter where you're looking at it, whether we're talking about the sovereign debt crisis, the housing collapse. I think the next crisis is not likely to be another Lehman, but another Japan. Basically, a widespread zombification of global economies to avoid the pain of a large, repricing of sovereign debts, which leads to massive tax hikes to pay the rising interests, economic recession, and unemployment, and also if you add to it the fact that the artificial intelligence and the robotics is such a big part of sixth technological development. Okay, fourth industrial revolution, sixth technological development, which is and big nanobiome for Cogno. What I talked about in my book, Trans-Evolution, the Coming Age of Human Deconstruction, which in the United States was nominated for Pulitzer Prize. And I explain how that's going to play such a big part short term in the United States alone because of the advancement in robotics and artificial intelligence. In the next decade, 32 million Americans are going to be out of a job. You already have 100 million Americans, working age Americans, who are not working. For all this talk about 3.5% unemployment, whatever the numbers are, I don't know. They just pull that a number out of a hat. You just Google 100 million Americans who are not working, 50 million Americans who survive thanks to, food coupons. California destroyed, wiped out because of this, insane policies that you're seeing. How many major cities in the United States are totally bankrupt? You want to talk about zombie, World War III zombie? Look at Detroit, look at Baltimore, look at Chicago, look at Philadelphia, look at Los Angeles, look at San Francisco. Look at any number of cities in the Midwest and Southeast and Florida, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean? And so all of that is playing such a key driving role in the need of the global elite behind Trump to get their grubby hands on Venezuela. Because again, although it's not going to make a difference, it's going to make a small 6-month difference, because getting their hands on Venezuela's natural resources, it's going to extend their lifeline, be it 6 months or a year. It's irrelevant, because in the end, we know how this thing ends. We know it's easy to see, just extrapolate what we have another couple of years. Okay, it's going to end very, very badly. And unfortunately, the people who run global financial institutions, as Nigel Farage said, back in his speech in the European Union, I can't remember when he said, all of you are in denial, and they are in denial, because it's unbelievable how stupid these people are.
And there are people that have put out books, such as Graham Allison recently, about the Thucydides trap, and he's looked at this historical cycle. So there's this clear historical cycle, and when empires rise and fall, and as you say, there are different factions, different empires. And he says that 12 out of the 16 times of these transitions, there were these global wars. And as you say, one option that I guess is still on the table is a greater world war. But let's say that doesn't happen. What do you foresee beyond that? Just the restructuring. Of course, we'll probably have this, huge economic crisis and collapse, and you say civil war type scenario in the U.S. But if there isn't this global war, what will come afterwards?
Well, there are different. There are different options. One is again world war. The second option is the United States goes to a sixth technological advancement, which is and big, not a buy-in for cogno. Okay, and that changes their picture greatly. Okay, and so the separation of areas of influence. The United States, Trump shuts the door, to their castle, and MAGA becomes a reality where the United States said, everything here is for us, and everyone else keeps out. And the Chinese do the same in China, which is again what we're seeing right now. The realignment going from the west to the east. This isn't the first time. If you kind of look historically, going back to the Venetian Empire, Venice went to England, then the Venetians from England, after they made England their home, they went to the United States because again, the United States. If you look at the creation of the Federal Reserve, if you look at the creation of Wall Street, all of this was done by the Venetians in the end. And now we're seeing the last stage, the passage from the Pacific area of influence to the Atlantic, to the Pacific area of influence. That's another solution, and that's what we're seeing right now with One Belt One Road initiative, Chinese initiative, which again. I'm having my doubts that this thing will work because the whole thing of China's One Belt One Road was territorial expansion based on a stratagem which was put together by Deng Xiaoping back in 1986, called Stratagem 863, which was a covert expansion, territorial expansion, towards the exterior of China's national interests. But the whole thing of One Belt One Road was based on the principle that if you make something in China, somebody on the other end is going to buy it. Unfortunately, today that somebody is no longer there, and we're seeing it right now. And one of the things I'm having my doubts, without getting too much into it, because it's beyond the scope of the interview, is that the whole One Belt One Road initiative was the Rothschilds and China working together. Because again, I said before that countries no longer exist. You're looking at global projects, and there are 6 global projects out there. One is, we can call it New Babylon, but it's really Wall Street financiers. The other one is London. Okay, that's London, Hasidic Jews, the Rothschilds, British royal family. Okay, the Kabbalists, that's another project. Then you have, Great Europe, the Vatican and the Black International. You have, Great Eurasia with Moscow as its capital, but that's not Putin. Okay, that's a different project. Then you have China, Red Caliphate, that's based in Turkey. So these are the 6 different projects. But the problem today is, for example, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. They were going to put their headquarters in Hong Kong. That was canceled now. Okay, because I think the Rothschilds, because Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, is the Rothschilds. And Standard Chartered is the Baruchs, which are the two, key elements of this project. Well, they canceled putting their headquarters in China, which leads me to believe that they don't really believe in the project itself, which is why the Chinese are creating different projects, which is why they're working on on giving something up in Latin America, such as Venezuela, and handing it over to the United States on a platter, and them receiving in return their area of influence, which is Southeast Asia and the Koreas. So again, as I said before, trade wars. It's not real. Okay, it's a ploy. It's part of the game on an intelligence level. It's like World Wrestling Federation. You have all these people fighting each other, but they're not really fighting. Okay, what they're doing is they're separating their areas of influence. Okay, and then another solution, and that also may work. As I said, so there's 3. You have one, global thermonuclear war. You have separation of interest. The Chinese, the energy moving to Asia, and the Americans are building their 6th technological advancement, which is not a buy for cogno and cold fusion to supplement. And they already have the patents for it, and Lockheed Martin has actually been working on it for the past since 2015. Sorry, another option, and that's where the Vatican comes in, and this will be like the last option because I know we're running out of time. Is the idea of the Black International getting their payback for losing World War II. Black International, again, National Socialism. It's Vatican. It's a rebirth of the Roman Empire of Germanic nations. Okay, and we're seeing it right now. It's the whole thing of trade from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Okay, it involves countries such as Portugal and France, Spain, Germany, Italy, and the Vatican. And people are wondering what that means. It's Salazar, it's Franco, it's Vichy, it's Hitler, it's Mussolini, it's Pope Pio XII. Okay, so again, so these are your options right now, and which is why again, Vatican is playing such an important part right now. They're right in the middle between the Chinese and Taiwan, trying to reach their diplomatic understanding. They want to be right in the middle of that. They're behind Juan Guaido, the opposition, the president of National Assembly in Venezuela, who decided to call himself new president of Venezuela. He's also the project of the Vatican, of the Jesuits. So again, a lot of stuff is happening under the radar. It's the kind of stuff you don't see in the mainstream media or any kind of media, because again, people pay too much attention to the noise. But if you turn off the noise and just look at the symbols, things become a lot clearer. And again, what you have to understand, in any kind of discussion you're having, on the political level, the background to it is that the model, which has worked since 1944, okay, for most of or half of the 20th century, is now dead. It can no longer work. Okay, as Karl Marx said and Adam Smith said, you reach a point where there's no such thing as infinite growth, and we're seeing it right now. And there is, no matter how much money you print, you simply can't paper over the problem we have. We reached the limits of growth on the planet Earth.
And if you could give us any concluding thought, and as well as what the average citizen, everyday person, what are the things they can do, whether it's, economically, or whether learning about these things, how do they best protect themselves, decipher, analyze these politics?
I think it's important to understand that this is real. Okay, the U.S. elections represented a shift in power from a faction in the United States establishment committed to maintaining a global empire to a faction intent on ensuring a robust and more self-sufficient economy in North America. So, if anything, this will accelerate the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world. And the question before us is whether the United States administration can re-engineer federal budgets to a positive return on investments. If it does not succeed, we are entering a very long, harsh financial squeeze. Worse also is that you have factions within the liberal establishment who want to tinker with the United States Constitution, which means that we have some serious trouble ahead. The most important question again is if they can re-engineer the return on investment to taxpayers of government investment, credit contracts, appropriations, and regulations from a negative to a positive return. And if they do that in the United States, and that of course will drive the rest of the economies worldwide, America will create explosive wealth. And if they don't, the country is in for a long, harsh financial squeeze, or maybe even civil war. Perhaps even a repeat of the rape of Russia of the 1990s period. For people, they have to understand that keeping lots of cash makes very little sense, because cash is not money. Okay, buy gold, physical gold. You can buy gold coins. You can buy 1, 3, 5 ounce, gold bars. And in the future, it's going to be obviously a much better investment than anything else you can buy. Stocks, bonds, all that stuff is going to collapse. It's all going down to hell. Stay away from that. Be liquid. Keep American dollars, Swiss francs, some euros, some pounds. But stay away from any currencies that fluctuate too much. Stay away from keeping too much cash in the bank. Try to keep it at home as much as possible, just enough in the bank, to do your daily or monthly transactions. Stay alert, stay vigilant, and realize that we are, almost at the end of the collapse financial model and cycle, which means that you may wake up one day very, very shortly, be it in 2 weeks, tomorrow, in 2 months, or in 6 months. Okay. And suddenly you realize the banks are closed, the money is gone, and there's a sign on the door that says gone fishing, and they're never coming back. And that's when things, shit's going to hit the fan, and you have to be ready.
Last question. Are there any new projects in the works for you, and how can people best follow and support Daniel Estulin?
Well, if you want to follow me, the only thing I have as far as social media is Twitter. I don't have Facebook. I don't have any of that stuff. And my Twitter feed is at Estulin Daniel, Estulin. My webpage is english.danielestulin.com, english.danielestulin.com. I give a lot of conferences worldwide, especially because, again, as I said in the beginning of the interview, we create models that define the future of humanity, and there's very few people out there who really understand what's going on. In fact, I didn't mention it, or I do explain it in my book. Back in 2014, I was like, 7 or 8 months before Trump even appeared on the scene, at the Dartmouth Conference, which is a very important conference, which was created by the Soviets and the Americans in the early 1960s. We were explaining, it was the day off of the day after the midterm elections in 2014. We were explaining to the American delegates that the next president is going to be or someone like Trump or someone like Bernie Sanders, so right-wing conservative or left-wing liberal. And again, it was like 7 or 8 months before Trump appeared on the scene, before he announced his candidacy. And we were dead right, because the economic model is dead and liberalism is dead. The elite simply couldn't allow anyone from the Clinton camp to get anywhere near the White House. It was just that obvious. Okay, so when the New York Times and the Newsweeks, with their infamous Madam Presidency, a magazine, dedicated to Clinton's presidency, we're talking about and singing Clinton's praise with, 93% possibility of her winning the elections. How could that be when, in 2014, on the 5th of November, we knew that Trump was going to win the presidency? Okay, so these are the kinds of things we do, and these are the kinds of things. When I say we, there's a group of people working on a supranational level, in Russia, who are, theoretical scientists, astrophysicists, et cetera, and we work on these models that, again, explain the future of humanity, and we are very seldom wrong. And I don't want to say we're never wrong, but we are very, very seldom wrong, because, again, we can foresee what's going to happen, which is, again, I'm warning people. Stay vigilant, stay alert. Don't pay attention to anything you read in the mainstream publications. And that's probably the best advice I can give them.
All right. People can listen to Daniel Estulin for hours. We've run out of time. I suggest everyone go get Daniel's books. There's a lot of them. Follow him on Twitter. I believe you tweet a lot. And it's been a pleasure. And thanks for coming on Geopolitics and Empire.
It's wonderful to have. Thank you so much for your invitation.